Wood City Council Manager Workshop. City Clerk Sint, would you please do the roll call for us?
Councilmember Lee.
Present.
Councilmember Villavicencio.
Here.
Councilmember Cave.
Here.
Councilmember Juniman.
Here.
Mayor Abrams.
I'm here as well. Thank you. Council members, would someone like to make a motion to approve our agenda?
So move.
Second.
Moved by Lee, seconded by Cave, the motion to approve our agenda. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, that all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. The motion passes. Any opposed? The motion passes. We have no unfinished business. We have new business tonight concerning cannabis regulations. And Mr. Beatty, you are our presenter tonight. Good evening and welcome.
Thank you. Good thing I showed up, huh? Mayor, Council, there's a lot of material here, and we can do this however you'd like. I thought that maybe we should try to take it in bite-sized pieces. There are three related but distinct issues that I've broken out in the memo, and so I'll go through them in that order, stop at the end of each one, see if there are questions, comments. You know, ultimately what staff's looking for is your direction as to what, if anything, the council wants to do about any of these issues. So if that seems acceptable, I'll launch into the first issue.
Thank you. Just so that the council is aware, I think it is a good idea that we're going to take it in bite-sized pieces. And so we'll talk about A, B, and C because you've got it laid out so nicely for us. And I think that's a much better way because I know you want direction from the council tonight.
Yeah, I think if we can talk about each piece as, you know, as the discussion concludes, we can then move on and not have to worry about the other stuff. So the first issue that I wanted to raise is with regard to how we're going to approach the newly approved cannabis matters. As you know, the statute was adopted the end of the session. Parts of it became effective actually immediately, which was May 31st. Parts became effective July 1st, and the last pieces will become effective August 1st, which basically legalizes the sale and possession of cannabis generally, but not the sale. And that's the issue that I think affects us. The statute establishes a new state department called the Office of Cannabis Management, which is going to be responsible for licensing the sellers and various other folks involved with this in this whole industry. I'm sure some of you have seen other material on this. There are going to be lots of different kinds of licenses, and a lot of has to happen before the Office of Cannabis Management, or OCM, is up and running and able to issue licenses. They were established on July 1st, at least technically, but they got to hire staff, they've got to train staff, they've got to come up with regulations. They are supposed to adopt sample ordinances for cities to look at. All of that needs to occur prior to the time when they are going to be able to issue licenses. And until that happens, sales are not legal. Cities are going to have a limited role in dealing with cannabis, unlike last year when we got new legislation and nobody was quite sure who was going to regulate and how we were going to regulate. In this case, it's pretty clear the state is going to take the lead, but cities do have a role to play, potentially. We can regulate, what the statute says is that cities are allowed to adopt what are called reasonable time, place, and manner regulations with regard to cannabis. Those will probably take the form of one or some of the following: zoning regulations. In other words, what districts do you want to allow them in? All retail districts or only certain retail districts? We're allowed to establish setbacks from certain uses. It's 1,000 feet from schools and 500 feet from daycares and areas in parks where children might congregate. The statute establishes hours of operation for retail businesses, much like they do with regard to alcohol sales, but cities can limit those more if we want to. There, each city has to have a number of businesses equal to, well, one for every 12,500 population, although the way the statute is written is a little bit different than some people are interpreting it. But anyway, every city is going to have at least one, or you will have to have a multiple of that depending on the population. We can set a maximum, we can set a limit on that if we choose to do so. So that's just a sampling of the kinds of regulations that the city will be able to consider and put in place if it wishes to do so. It's hard to articulate, it's hard to come up, it would be hard to come up with a set of ordinances at this point to address those issues because we don't know what the state regulations are going to be. There are some ambiguities. For example, I mentioned about the, the number of licenses. The way I read the statute, it seems pretty clear that it's one for every 12,500, but the folks who were closer to some of the people who authored the bill seem to think that it's one for the first 25,000 and then one for every 12,500 after that. So that's an ambiguous, well, I don't think it's ambiguous, but there's an ambiguity there. I think that's one of the things that's going to have to come out in the wash as the OCM gets organized. It doesn't matter if you don't want to set a maximum limit on or a minimum limit on the number of uses, but otherwise it would, if Maplewood wanted to do that, that would be the difference between having to have 3 or 4 businesses. So there are a number of things that have to play out. They're supposed to, the office is supposed to come up with draft sample ordinances for cities to look at. What's not clear at this point is whether those are going to be just examples that cities can look at or whether they're going to be more similar to what the DNR does with shorelands regulations. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but the statute requires that every city adopt shoreland regulations which are acceptable to the DNR. The DNR has come up with sample ordinances which many cities just adopt, because if you don't adopt them and you want to deviate from those, you still have to run your ordinances by the DNR. So they're samples, but they're pretty prescriptive. In other words, you have to either follow our ordinance or come very close to it before the DNR is going to approve it. Who knows whether these ordinances are going to be that prescriptive or, again, whether they're going to be more samples. So anyway, lots of stuff that's in play. This is going to take a while. The estimates that I heard when the bill was first adopted is that the state was probably not going to be in a position to start licensing until late 2024. Since then, I've heard that pushed back to some extent, so it might be closer to the beginning of 2025. Cities are authorized, or local governments, it applies not only to cities but to townships, are authorized to adopt interim ordinances to impose a moratorium on the sale of cannabis products until January 1st of 2025. And so that's the first thing that you should consider whether you want to do that. You know, I guess the question is, well, if nobody can sell anything until the state issues licenses, why do we need a moratorium in the meantime? I think the answer to that is because there's going to be a lot going on at the state, and when the state is ready to issue licenses, which I've given you the estimated dates, but we don't really know when that's going to be, they're going to start issuing licenses. And the risk, if we don't have a moratorium, is that we get caught short, that we haven't put our regulations in effect. They start issuing licenses, and all of a sudden we have to play catch up. So I think the advantage of a moratorium would be for us to have that period of time to watch what's going on with the state, start figuring out what, if any, of those various things that I talked about we want to regulate, put our own ordinances in place. And again, some of them are probably going to involve some zoning issues, which, as you know, is more cumbersome because it has to go through the Planning Commission, public hearing. It's not something we can just turn around on a dime. So it makes sense for us to have some time, I think, to be able to look at all of that stuff. So the moratorium would protect the city in case the state gets its act together more quickly than anticipated, starts issuing licenses, and then we're kind of caught. So that's my comment about the newly approved cannabis products, which is the bulk of the new statute. Not everything, but it's the bulk of it.
Thank you, Mr. Beatty. Council members, this is certainly a new day, and I really hope that our council will be very intentional. There's so many things that we don't know. The good news is that every other city in the state of Minnesota is also grappling with this. I don't know if some of you saw the article that was in the Pioneer Press just last week, but I asked Joe if he would print out one of the articles. This is actually from MinPost, but just to kind of give you some additional information about what other cities, and this particular article from MinPost talks about Duluth, Alexandria, Detroit Lakes, Lakeville, West St. Paul, because every other city is also going to be grappling with this, and there are just so many questions and preparation that we need to take into consideration so that we do this right. And I certainly don't want to leave anything to just, guess and by golly. Your report, really I found it very compelling. Until the OCM is up and running and the above steps have been accomplished, it'll be virtually impossible for a city to draft thoughtful ordinances to address these issues. The statute recognizes this and authorizes cities to adopt an interim ordinance establishing a moratorium. In addition to ordinances, we also have to think about training for our police officers. One of the things that also is in Ron's report, cities may register businesses and then must conduct compliance checks. So there's just so much that's new. Correct me if I'm wrong, but someone told me, I was up at the league conference, and there was one of the conference breakout sessions on cannabis and what cities need to know and how to do this and to do it correctly, very intentionally. But someone said that the actual statute is over 300 pages long. Is that correct?
321 by my count.
Okay, 321 pages, so there is a lot to synthesize. So, council members, I'll just jump out there, and I am in favor of an interim ordinance establishing a moratorium so that we can really take our time, that we can go through this. I'm anxious to see the sample ordinances that the state is going to put out. Do we have any timeline for that?
No.
Okay.
No, I mean, I think that the fact that the statute allows the city or a city to put a moratorium in place for almost 18 months, that tells you something right there. I mean, as you know from other experience, most moratoria are statutorily limited to 12 months. Here's one that allows the city to put it in place for till January 1st of 2025, so it gets a little bit less than 18 months. But I think that's a pretty good indication that the legislature realized that there's an awful lot here, 321 pages, most of it, or a lot of it, very technical stuff, but it's a whole new department being created, all of the things that I described. I mean, it's a whole new world that has to happen. And so I think that's a recognition that it's going to take some time for this to be worked out. And that's why they've giving cities the option for a longer than average moratorium.
Thank you for that explanation, and I think that will give us time to make sure that we do it right. Councilmember Cave, I saw your light on.
A couple questions. One, can we get ordinances to look at? Would it be valuable from other states? that have them, or is that going to be a moot point?
Well,
Be able to look
yeah,
at.
that's an interesting point, I think, because I think Minnesota is the 23rd state to legalize marijuana, so there's certainly other states. What I don't know is how comparable Minnesota's statute is with others. You know, if the council decides to adopt a moratorium, my suggestion is going to be not that we go to sleep for the next 15 or 16 months, but that we do pay attention to what's happening. And as these various things occur, regulations are promulgated by the new department, that sample ordinances come out as they clarify, hopefully, some of the ambiguities in the statute, that we take that we follow that progress and then use that to sort of start formulating what it is that we want, so that as they get close to finalizing their process and get close to issuing licenses, we have a pretty good idea of what we want. But I will take a look at whether there are a lot of people who know this stuff better than I do, whether ordinances from other states would be helpful, or whether that's just another 300-page read
Okay.
that we don't want to get into.
And another question, and this is kind of like a broad one, but it sounds like the state is going to be determining who is going to get a license in Maplewood. Do we have any say in, I mean, if they pick a liquor store, let's just say, that we've had problems with, and it wouldn't be one that we're kind of like, wow, that one's kind of, we've had a lot of issues there. Do we have any input in where the licensing, I know what the, like, restrictions away from parks and all that, we can do zoning,
Yeah.
but do we have any say in who gets the license?
I believe to a limited degree, as you say, when a license application is made to the state and they process it however they're going to process it, they have to notify the city. And I think we have, one place I read 21 days, one place I read 30 days. We have some relatively limited period of time to comment. One of the things they're looking for is zoning approval. In other words, is the proposed location in a district that the city has chosen to allow it to be located in? But there is a provision in the statute that says that as part of our response back to the state, we can comment upon other items of interest, which I think probably goes to the point that you're making, that if there are other things that we are aware of that location, that operator, that whatever, that we think are relevant with regard to that, we can also include those in our response to the state. Again, pretty broad. I think those are going to be one of the things, one of the many things that we'll be looking at for clarification as the regulations come out.
Okay, thank you.
Good questions. Councilmember Villavicencio.
Thank you. I was wondering if we could just get clarification. Maybe we could talk about how the moratorium that we had already put in place interacts with the proposed moratorium. Because the first moratorium that we proposed was on the low potency of hemp products. And is this one on low potency and the newly authorized, or just the newly authorized cannabis?
Just the newly authorized. The next thing I will talk about will be, okay, the moratorium that you adopted last year and is about to expire, what do we do about that? But good question, they're two separate things. This moratorium is strictly with regard to the newly authorized products that cannot be sold until the state starts issuing licenses.
Okay, thank you. I guess I'm just thinking about that in the sense that that's what makes this bill complicated and complex too, is because right now, as August 1st, it can be grown, right?
Yes.
And taken, but not sold.
Use, possession, and limited home growing of up to 8 plants it will be legal as of August 1st.
And, okay, so I guess maybe my questions are around the sense of, like, how do we regulate, or how do we create an ordinance that could prevent trying to create a workaround, being able to not sell it, but give it, if that makes any sense.
Well, there are provisions in the statute. Again, I've read parts of it, but I have not read all 321 pages. But there are, you're allowed to have, possess, I think, 2 ounces. You can have at home 2 pounds. There are various other limitations, and I think you can give similar amounts to people. I mean, if that's what you're talking about, there are already limitations in the statute with regard to that.
I guess maybe my question is more around how does that work with enforcement? And, because it's like in a way, it's relaxing the law that existed beforehand, right? But we can't sell it legally.
Not yet.
Not yet. So, in the world of enforcement, how do we make sure that the city knows what's going on in a city, right? So I guess what I'm saying is, if we put a moratorium, the way that the moratorium that we put on before worked, that if the product was being sold before the moratorium started, technically they could continue, right? There was a loophole on.
I don't want to get into Part B yet. Let's
Sure.
just talk about A. But I think I understand your question, and what we're talking about, what the report talks about, and I think what Mr. Beatty was telling us, is that this is a moratorium concerning selling it. We aren't talking about anything else. Is that correct, Mr.
Yes,
Beatty?
that is correct.
Okay, that's all that we're talking about, and you can't sell it in Minnesota anyway until we have the new OCM and the sample ordinances and all of the, we have a lot of work to do.
Absolutely, sure.
But the moratorium, as it's written here, the way I read it, we're only talking about the sale. And
Absolutely.
you can't sell it in the state anyway, because as of August 1st, Mr. Beatty just indicated home possession, that type of thing, some limited growing. There are restrictions in there, but all of that is going to be legal. And our police department, I'll call upon Chief Beardeman in just a minute, but they're going to have to, they will, obviously we have to follow, we're obligated, we follow the law. So maybe that's a good time, Mr. Chief Beardeman, to talk about enforcement as of August 1st.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and Council. Are you asking specifically with an ordinance you'd likely pass, or you talking about possession?
Possession, yeah, just with possession, not with, because you can't sell it until 2025.
Yep, there are state, part of the statute is that if you're in possession of more than you're allowed, so more than the 2 pounds, that is enforceable. But again, this is new to us as well, and we haven't fully been trained on it. So much like Ron hasn't read all 300 and some pages, we're still in the process of wrapping our head around this and figuring out how we're going to enforce some of these statutes that are being put out. So I don't have an exact answer for you yet, but the statute does say that you can't have more than that amount, and it does give the penalties for that. But again, we haven't figured out exactly how we're going to enforce, or what that's going to look like yet.
We have a lot to learn. Mr. Beatty, do you want to weigh in on that too?
Well, and I was going to say, my suspicion is that the state is going to be more active in regulating sales in this context, because again, last year, when the edibles, they're called something different under the low potency. They're not exactly the same, but they're largely the same as what we were calling edibles, but I'll use that term because we remember that from last year. When the edibles were legalized, it was not clear who was going to regulate them, if anybody was. There was no role for the state, there was no role for cities, and so, most cities, including Maplewood, stepped in, at least limitedly, and imposed a moratorium. In this case, the state is going to play a much greater role, and it's going to be against state law to sell anything until the state starts issuing licenses. So I think there's going to be a level of, my suspicion is there'll be a different level of enforcement on sales of these products than there was with the edibles.
report indicates if the city council wishes to consider an interim ordinance to establish a moratorium on cannabis sales, only the sales, it will need to hold a public hearing. So that if the council wants to do that, then the next step would be putting it together and holding a public hearing. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And actually, I've already, in anticipation of what you might want to do, I've already drafted a moratorium. You know, Canadian Graven represents about 50 cities and, I don't know, several hundred townships probably. And as far as I know, many, I hesitate to say most, many of them either have or are going to adopt a moratorium. So we've developed sort of a sample moratorium, which I've actually sent to Melinda in case you want to consider it. It does require a public hearing, doesn't indicate what type of notice is required. We're recommending the standard 10 days. And so because there's a 3-week gap between this meeting and your first meeting in August, if you were interested in pursuing it and doing so as quickly as possible, we could actually have the public hearing and have you consider the moratorium at your August 14th meeting.
Thank you for that clarification. And council members, if you want to just glance at this, it does indicate other cities are grappling with this as well and trying to figure out what's the right thing to do. Councilmember Lee, I see that you have your light on.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a quick question for the chief. I'm curious, in your opinion, how much time do you think it would take for the department to be trained around regulations and also enforcement around the cannabis piece of it? Just a rough ballpark. Just want to understand that piece.
I guess I don't have an exact answer for you, just because we don't know the extent of what this is going to look like yet, but, you know, maybe a month just to get up to speed or a couple trainings, depending on what that's going to look like. But I don't anticipate it's going to be a lot once it's clear, the path and what we need to do. I think we can adjust fairly quickly, but it's a matter of getting the resources to actually enforce it. And if we have the bandwidth to actually, you know, enforce some of these laws is a different story. But the training shouldn't be too extensive.
Thank you. Councilmember Cave.
What was I going to say? So we don't know if there's a possibility that we could need more resources in the police department with this.
That's correct.
So it's something that the council needs to think, because that's budgeting.
Right.
So this could cause a budget increase on our budget. Okay, I just want to make sure.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
There are a lot of moving pieces in all of this. So council members, we have 2 other points to make on this. So I'm going to start with Councilmember Cave down here. In terms of moratorium, we're going to take each one of these by chunk. What is your thought?
Yes.
Okay, Councilmember Juniman. Yes. Okay, Councilmember Lee.
Yes.
Councilmember Villavicencio.
Not at this time, no.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Beatty, does that give you
Yes.
sufficient information concerning the moratorium?
Yes, and the only other thing I'd ask, would you like to see it as at your next meeting?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
We will
We're
tee
shaking our head.
that up.
Thank
Yes.
you. Okay, moving on to regulation of edibles. B,
Yes.
do you want to take that, please?
Yes. Well, this is the issue we sort of touched on a minute ago. This is what do we do about the statute that was adopted last year, and that in response to which we adopted a moratorium. You know, as we've kind of talked about again tonight, and I know you remember from last year, nobody quite knew what to do with this. The ordinance or the statute was not particularly clear. It was not clear whether the city had any authority to regulate or any prohibition against that. And so Maplewood, like many cities, put an interim ordinance and declared a moratorium with the belief that in the next year, particularly the next legislative session, there would be clarity. Well, that didn't exactly happen. And I think the new bill does deal with the edibles to some extent, but not in the comprehensive manner that we were kind of thinking about last year. And I think that's because events outran it. I mean, the edibles were the big thing last year. They're now sort of the small fry in all of this. And so the new bill focused the vast majority of the attention on the newly approved stuff and didn't spend a lot of time on the edibles. But we're still faced with what do we do when the moratorium expires, which will be the end of August. And I pointed out in the memo, we have a couple of options. One is to do nothing. In other words, just let the moratorium expire. It's sort of the, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Have we had problems? Nobody has been able to sell legally, at least nobody's been able to start selling legally since the moratorium went into place. But I think it's highly likely that there are a number of places that have done so. And so have we had problems with any of that? Do we want to change anything? If we don't think there have been problems, the first option is to literally do nothing and let the moratorium simply expire. The state is going to take over licensing of these products as well as the newly approved products. Anybody who wants to sell is going to have to register with the state by October 1st of this year. And then again, the state will get around to licensing them at some point in the future. It's not clear whether it's going to be on the same schedule as the newly approved products or a different schedule. But eventually the state's going to take over the licensing of those as well. So first option is do nothing. Second option is sort of the polar opposite, and that is ban them, which would have the effect of de facto prolonging the moratorium, at least from a legal perspective. They would still be illegal. It raises the enforcement issue that we grappled with last time. We imposed the moratorium, but we were pretty clear that we weren't going to make any efforts to go out and hunt people down and see anything about that, see if anybody was doing it. So if we banned them, again, sales would continue to be illegal, but we'd still have that, are we going to ignore it, continue to ignore it, or what do we want to do? The third option is to put a licensing scheme into effect. Last year, when the statute was adopted, some cities adopted a moratorium. Some cities put in a licensing scheme where they would license cannabis, the edible sellers, just like you would license alcohol or tobacco. To some extent, they combine those with zoning and other regulations as to where those businesses could locate. In some cities, though, it was really more of an attempt to be informed as to who was selling. It was more of an attempt just to know who's out there rather than necessarily trying to limit where people could locate. In any event, we chose not to do that. It's possible to put a licensing scheme into effect going forward if we want to. There's a bit of a challenge with that because that isn't going to, it would be difficult to have a comprehensive licensing scheme in effect before the moratorium elapses. And if you don't have it into effect by then you have the same non-conforming issues that we talked about a minute ago. The other thing about a licensing scheme is that the licensing is going to be taken over by the state. So if you put a licensing scheme in place and do whatever you're going to have to do to get that up and running, it's only going to be for a year, 16 months or something, when all of that's going to go away because the state is going to catch up. So, that's the other thing to consider. The fourth option, which is probably the most nuanced, is, do you want to impose any zoning restrictions or setbacks and have those in place by the time the moratorium expires? There is a limited window to do that. If it's a zoning ordinance, then that's going to have to go through the Planning Commission, and there is a Planning Commission meeting in August 15th, I believe, so it is possible to have a public hearing before the Planning Commission that night and bring that back to you at your second meeting in August and beat by a couple of days the expiration of the moratorium. But it kind of goes back to, what are you trying to address? Are there problems that have emerged in the last year that we would want to address? If not, maybe it's again, let things expire because we don't we don't see a problem, or we don't have a fix. So anyway, to me, those are the options as to what to do about last year's issue of edibles.
Thank you, Mr. Beatty. I have a question about number 4, adopt zoning or other ordinances. What might be an example of other ordinances?
Setback requirements.
I'm sorry, what?
Setback requirements.
Okay, okay. Councilmember Villavicencio, I think you were first.
I was wondering, is there any sample ordinances or setbacks that would include limiting it to only tobacco and liquor? Like, would you be able to show us any examples of an ordinance that would say that's what we want to limit it to?
In other words, sales would only be allowed in those kinds of stores?
Yeah, for example.
I have not seen an ordinance like that, so a lot of people in my office are developing ordinances in response to meetings like this, and we talk about it on a fairly regular basis. I haven't seen any ordinances like that, so I don't have a sample that I could give you. I think the issue would be why, what would be the rationale for limiting it to people who have liquor licenses or tobacco licenses? I mean, it's a policy decision, but given the fact that I think we assume that it's being sold in many, many places, is there some reason to limit it to tobacco and alcohol? I mean, remember that on-sale liquor license holders are able to sell for on-site consumption now, except for our moratorium, and off-sale liquor stores are also able to sell off-sale. Those went into effect May 31st. And so those sales are legal except if there's a local restriction. In Maplewood, there is a local restriction. The moratorium bans those, but as soon as the moratorium goes off, those sales are going to be legal.
On what Nikki said, can I, the
Just
fact
one
that.
second.
oh,
You know what? We'll come back to that, but I
Okay.
want to, I'm kind of trying to, I'm trying to respect
Okay.
the light, so. Council, are you okay? Okay, Councilmember Cave.
Just would it be tobacco and liquor stores have 21 and older? Could that be a reason why you'd limit it to tobacco stores and alcohol and liquor stores?
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose that that's a possibility.
Okay. You just asked the question, so I
Yeah.
thought I'd,
Yeah, well, I mean, whenever you have a regulation, you have to think, okay, what's the justification for that? Many times, if cities have multiple commercial districts, for example, you might take a look at them and say, we're going to allow sales in this district, but not that district. Well, what's the rational basis for that? Probably because you make a distinction between other types of retail sales and permit them in one district and not the other, and feel in the exercise of your discretion that sales would be more acceptable in one district rather than the other. So I'm not suggesting that you couldn't do that. I'm just saying whenever you make that kind of distinction, you have to say, why would we do that? And maybe the fact that both of those kinds of stores are used to dealing with age limitations is potentially an argument in favor of that.
Mr. Beatty, one question kind of following up with this. Is there any interrelationship with doing ordinances with setbacks and restrictions for cannabis and for edibles? Is there any interrelationship with that? And, if we did one, why would we do another? Are they related? Can a store that sells cannabis, can they also sell edibles? Is there some type of correlation that we need to think about?
Well, they are correlated to some degree. I mean, there are variations on the same kind of product. I just suspect that as time goes on, and maybe that time has already arrived, I think the focus, both from an enforcement standpoint and probably from a public perception standpoint, is going to be on the newly approved products rather than the edibles. I mean, I think last year the focus was on the edibles because that was the only thing that was out there. Now I suspect that they're going to be something that nobody pays a whole lot of attention to, maybe.
Would it create more confusion if we had no ordinances for edibles? Or is there some benefit to having something that is parallel or similar so that we look at all of that together and the interrelationship, if any?
It's a good question. Again, I think that's a policy question. As I said, I suspect that people aren't going to be as worried about the edibles going forward, given what's now legal. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just, I think my sense is that if edibles are available at every convenience store and so forth, that's probably not where the attention is going to be. It's going to be on the more potent material that has recently been legalized, and I think that's probably what people will be concerned about. So
Okay.
they're related, but I can see easily how you could make a distinction between the two.
Okay, thank you for that. Councilmember Lee, and then Councilmember Cave.
Thank you, Mayor. Reading through this process and looking at the three options, one, ignoring it, the second one, banning it, and the third one, licensing it, or the other one, adopting and zoning, the four option here. My expectation was that last year when the moratorium was adopted was that something was going to be put in place. And here we are about a year in and nothing has happened now. I think ignoring it would be irresponsible for us as a city. I think that we need to, we take, in my months that I've been here, I see that we take tobacco and alcohol very seriously. And I think that this is something right up there where we cannot just ignore it. The other option was banning it. I think that with banning it, there will be economic impacts to some of our businesses in the city of Maplewood. Not knowing what St. Paul or some of our sister or bordering cities are going to do, I think we're going to be restricting, and there's going to be some consequences there for our businesses, so I would not be in favor of banning it. But I am interested in the licensing portion of it. I think it is important for us to license our business who are selling these products, so that way we can at least then manage it and then also enforce what we're selling, what's in the market, what's in our city, whose hands are they going into. So that's what I'm interested in doing. And looking at this, and there's cities and states that have been doing this for a couple of years now. I don't know, would it be complicated to pull something from another city to look at to see what their policies are around licensing? Is that something that our city can perhaps pick up very easily? And maybe that's a question for Mike and Melinda, but what would that look like in terms of enforcement? But I would be interested in exploring what that licensing process would be like. Because the thing is, 12 months to 18 months, you think about it, that is a long time. And to just let this go 12 to 18 months, I just don't think that is acceptable.
There are a number of sample ordinances out there, or actual ordinances on licensing. Some of them are quite complicated and quite detailed because the city wanted to prohibit the location of businesses in some districts and not others. And so that's where you get down into zoning and other sort of considerations. Those are more detailed. Some of the other ordinances are much more simple. They really, as I said earlier, were more intended to simply notify the city as to who was selling. But it still means adopting an ordinance, having staff trained on that, coming up with an application form, telling people who've probably been selling already that they need to be licensed, and pursuing them and having them go through that process, and having whatever kind of either staff or council licensing, or probably a council licensing process, have run all those people through and accomplish, I think what you need to figure out is, what are we trying to accomplish? Are we trying to restrict them to certain districts, or do we simply want to know who's out there? And depending on the answer to that question, then we can put together a simpler or more complicated licensing. But again, knowing that events are going to overtake us, and whatever we put into effect, the state is going to take over within some reasonable period of time.
You know, I agree with Councilmember Lee in terms of, you know, we put the moratorium in place expecting that we would get some clarification from the legislature that really never materialized. And now we're looking at something else. My concern about doing the licensing is that, you know, in 12 to 18 months, the state is going to take it over. And we don't currently have staff that we can, you know, we would have to probably do some hiring. It would take us quite a bit to gear up in order to do that, and then to get compliance. And then by the time the 12 months is up, the state is taking it over anyway. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so I guess I struggle with that. I'm trying to balance out doing nothing, the fact that we waited for the legislature, that didn't happen. I guess I'm not interested in adding staff, because then we'd have to lay off the staff after 12. What would they do? The state's going to take it over, and then the process would just evaporate, because the state will be licensing and we won't be licensing. What I'm more interested in, maybe in terms of doing something, is exploring districts, zoning, or other ordinances, and looking at that perspective, because that, to me, you know, that's something that our current staff can, and Ron can help us with some direction and some focus with that, because I just think creating a whole new licensing, not department, but a function of the city, when it's going to go away in 12 months, anyway, 12 to 18 months. I want to do something, because I think it is important that we know who's selling, but I want to be able to look at this both from an internal perspective and also from a bigger perspective. What does this look like? Because we're making some very big changes in our community. And so I would be more interested in the adding zoning or other ordinances as opposed to licensing. So let's see if other people want to weigh in. I think, Rebecca, you were next.
Yep, and that's exactly what I wanted to weigh in, because I think doing nothing sends a mixed message that we want to do something with cannabis, but now all of a sudden we're okay with edibles and doing nothing with it. So to wrap up, so I don't repeat everything, doing something simple like finding out where the edibles are being sold, I think is fine. I think it would have been great to go back 6 months and say we should look at zoning, but I think we're at the end of our moratorium term, so we can't add more time to it. Unfortunately, I think, you know, I understand with licensing, we don't need to hire somebody only to have the state take over, but I also don't think we all of a sudden just drop the ball on the edibles, because it is underneath the cannabis umbrella. So I think if we could look at something about finding out where the locations are, because it will help us for zoning for the future, whether or not we end up using them for, you know, then we come up with a zoning area and say, wow, there's no one in here and they can't be here, and it will help us know where people are. So if we can find some knowledge-based information with
So
it.
you're talking about at least having people notify us that they're selling, and then looking at zoning ordinances? Mr. Beatty?
Well, those are two distinct issues. We can do one or both of those. I guess I kind of anticipated that other staff people were going to be here tonight. And the reason I say that is that we had a pretty good discussion about a week ago, and I raised these issues with the staff and the planet, for what it's worth. I hate to put words in people's mouths, but since they're not here, the planning staff was of the opinion that they were comfortable with these sellers, the edible sellers, being in any of the retail districts, that they could not see any rational basis for distinguishing one district from another. So they were not in favor of a zoning approach to this, for what that's worth. Now, It's council's decision, but it's a decision that has to be made very rapidly because we got to put together an ordinance, have the public hearing before the planning commission in 3 weeks, and bring that back to you at your last meeting in August. Doable, but very tight.
Rebecca, did you have another
Yeah,
follow-up?
just quick. I guess I was thinking if zoning's going to be so, like, we don't have time for that. I think zoning is something we can do for the future because we're going to need it for the cannabis.
Yes.
So if we find out who who's selling the edibles is A, but B, we don't have to have that done in a month. I mean, that's part of, under the umbrella of the cannabis umbrella, I'm thinking, for the zoning. That's going to come under where we're going to allow these in the future.
Well, the zoning for the, for the cannabis that we talked about at first is only for the newly authorized products. Once the moratorium expires, anybody who's selling the edibles is going to have a non-conforming use argument if we impose zoning restrictions on them after the fact.
After the moratorium
Yes,
expires.
yes.
So we would have to do the zoning before.
But can we extend the moratorium at
No.
all? Absolutely not. Right.
Right.
They don't make this easy on us, do they?
No.
Did you have any other questions? Okay, then Councilmember Villavicencio, and then Councilmember Juniman.
I just wanted to add on what Rebecca said is, that's what I'm interested in from a city perspective is who is selling it and what they're selling. I think, another reason why it's important is, they can identify as being low potency, but then be selling high potency. And I think that's where it is important, where they're selling them. Because if they're saying they're low potency, but they're selling high potency, then that's definitely matter. Oh, thank you. I think that definitely matters.
Councilmember Juniman.
I only have one comment. Thank you to the legislature for another ongoing gift.
Councilmember Lee.
Thank you, Mayor. My concern about the zoning piece of it is that we're going to be limiting certain business entrepreneurs in our community. So that's where what I'm concerned about without knowing anything at all, going into the zoning portion of it, because the reality is real estate comes down to real estate, affording a property to establish these type of businesses. So that's why I am not in favor of looking at the zoning portion of it until we understand a little bit more. But if we start licensing it and understanding where these businesses are happening, I think that really opens up the opportunity for just entrepreneurs in general.
Mr. Beatty, is there some type of compromise here in terms of something that is short of licensing because of really the burden on creating a new licensing department or division for the state or for the city? Is there something where we could get information without taking that to the next step of actually doing licensing?
I think that's a good point. Listening to what I'm hearing some of you want, it sounds more like a registration process, perhaps, than a licensing process. In other words, let us know you're out there. I don't think that we have the technical capability of figuring out what they're selling in terms of whether it's legal or not. There's a lot of technicality there in terms of whether it really, the potency is limited to whatever. And I know there's a lot of stories out there about people, as was said, people selling things that are more potent than they should be. But that's just completely, in my opinion, that's way beyond the city's technical ability to go into a store and figure out that those two products are okay, but these are not. So maybe what you're really talking about is a registration process where we're not going to turn anybody down. It's simply come in and let us know, and so at some point we know who's there. I can certainly do that, but again, anyone who wants to sell or continue to sell or start selling is going to have to register with the state by October 1st. So we're going to have that information in a couple of months anyway. Yes.
And I take it that the state is the the state is the one that goes into the shops that are selling edibles now, and they actually do the testing to determine if they are selling low potency or something that is beyond what they're legally able to sell.
I don't know that the state's doing anything at this point. I mean, if you remember last year when all of this was created, it was the Department of Pharmacy, or which has what,
yeah.
14 or 15 employees, that was responsible for doing this. I mean, it's just a task that, so I wouldn't assume that there's any review of that kind of stuff. So, again, if you want to put a registration provision in a place, that's fine, but the state is going to require that anyway by October 1st. So,
We will get access to that information.
Yeah. I mean, if you're a seller or want to be a seller, you're going to have to register. I think it's now with the Department of Health by October 1st. So we're going to know that.
Okay. Councilmember Lee.
Sorry, thank you, ma'am. I'm still processing a little bit. I'm just thinking about my experience of working with small business owners, the government asking you to give them information willingly. How willing are they? And my purpose of this is not to restrict anyone from selling these products. We want to be able to help them and support them be successful entrepreneurs and business owners. But as a voluntary system, we cannot help these businesses. I mean, some of them are not going to turn it in. They may not register with us. I don't know what the vending market looks like, what that looks like out there, how they can get access to these on that end of it. But I'm just concerned that having a registration process is not going to be able to help us capture the information that we want, as I don't think business owners will be upfront about the products and services that they're providing to our community.
One of the things that, just in thinking about that, we kind of went through something like this when it was about, the council at one point in time discussed flavored tobacco and restricting flavored tobacco. And my concern about that is that Maplewood is contiguous with 11 other cities. And we have a lot of small businesses that if they aren't able to sell something, they're going to go right across the street to Oakdale, they're going to go to North St. Paul or St. Paul or Newport or any one of the other cities, White Bear Lake, and buy from a business that is able to sell. And so I certainly agree with you.